rainwater that you're collecting on your own property. An Oregon man was sentenced to 30 days in jail for collecting rainwater on his personal property.
The swingin' 60s had a lot going on, from sensitive issues and rights movements to bizarre trends the public had to keep up with. Who knew that dancing on Sundays could put you behind bars? It's just one of 20 weird things from the 1960s that were illegal. Dancing on Sundays. One might enjoy a happy Sunday with good friends, drinks, and some vibrations playing on the record player while slow dancing, but dancing on Sundays was illegal. As bizarre as it sounds, it's true. Dancing on Sundays was considered illegal in the 1960s. This ban was due to blue laws, which were rooted in religious and moral beliefs about observing the Sabbath. The laws were aimed to restrict secular or sinful activities on Sundays, a day reserved for rest and religious rituals in Christian communities. The idea originated from a strict interpretation of the Fourth Commandment, which commands believers to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. In highly religious areas, this rule was taken seriously, with penalties, fines, and even short jail terms, and dancing was allowed only in places that held a dancing license. Blue laws are still upheld in some places today. In Texas, buying beer or wine before 11 a.m. on Sundays is illegal, and all liquor stores remain closed during that time. Owning a slot machine. We can't make our own luck because owning a slot machine is illegal in various states in the United States. Slot machines are considered a form of gambling, and since most states don't allow casino-style betting, the ownership and operation of a slot machine is outlawed. Slot machines are not ordinary machines that give out a couple of dollars. They're deeply associated with organized crime syndicates, especially in cities like Las Vegas and Chicago. Criminal organizations would allow the operation of gambling dens, with slot machines being a key component. This would prompt the U.S. government to seize the opportunity to ban the machines, aiming to curb the growing influence of criminals and illegal gambling. However, the government missed out on some solid economic opportunities. States implemented this law lost significant tax revenue that could have been generated from legal slot machines in regulated environments. It not only led to economic loss, but also expanded underground gambling, making it more dangerous and less regulated, and in turn contributed to crime and exploitation. For some people, the ban was seen as a restriction on personal freedom, preventing individuals from owning or using slot machines, even for non-commercial purposes. Owning more than 50 pounds of potatoes. Now, we all love potatoes, fries, patties, and vodka. However, owning potatoes came with a limit. If you owned more than 50 pounds of them, you could be subjected to a fine or short-term jail. This rule was rooted in fears that large corporations and individuals could monopolize the potato market by stockpiling large quantities, controlling the supply, and driving up the price. It was part of an antitrust farming law designed to prevent market manipulation and unfair competition in agriculture. Larger amounts could be owned if the person could prove they were a commercial potato farmer or seller. Individuals were not allowed to own more than 50 pounds without showing proof that they weren't hoarding or engaged in commercial activities. Jokes about the potato police became a never-ending amount of humor. Using a motorized skateboard on public roads. A motorized skateboard doesn't sound all that efficient, but surprisingly, they've been quite controversial. Their design was not entirely reliable. Without speed control, brakes, and rider protection, they posed a significant risk to both the rider and pedestrians. Traffic rules, primarily focused on motorcycles and cars, left a lack of oversight for motorized skateboards, which was one of the main issues. Motorized skateboards move faster than pedestrians but slower than vehicles, making them unpredictable on public roads and sidewalks, where they could easily collide with people. However, considering that they were 100% emission-free, they're a favorable option for many. Traveling a shorter distance becomes hassle-free and allows riders to avoid getting stuck in traffic. Collecting rainwater. The government implemented water laws that made collecting rainwater illegal, especially in areas with limited water resources. Authorities believe that collecting rainwater could divert a resource that should flow into the rivers, streams, or other shared water systems. By regulating water use, the government aimed to prevent overexploitation of water by individuals or corporations that might divert it for profit. However, if you're wondering whether you could fill a barrel from your roof, the answer is yes. This rule was primarily implemented for farmers who needed to collect gallons of water for their crops, as that water is often considered a shared resource belonging to various bodies within the region. Large water companies or powerful agricultural interests often exploited these laws to their advantage, monopolizing water rights while limiting access to small landowners. This could result in a concentration of resources in the hands of a few disadvantaged smaller farmers and communities. But don't worry, we can still collect water for our flower garden. Sharing food in public. It's better to give than receive apparently didn't hold in the United States during the 60s. Sharing food in public was actually illegal. Hotels and food chains giving leftovers to the homeless is still considered as such. Whatever the rationale behind it, the idea of throwing away food seems genuinely bad. City councils and health officials enacted ordinances that prohibited or regulated the sharing of food in public spaces due to health concerns while preventing the spread of disease. Companies faced lawsuits for distributing leftovers, which resulted in hefty fines, and perhaps the right to food should be strictly upheld to avoid homeless people having to dig through the trash for a meal. Carrying concealed weapons without a permit. The crime rate in America surged during the 1960s, and this rise in crime and violence contributed to the perception that carrying concealed weapons posed a threat to public safety, leading to regulations which ensured only responsible and trained individuals were allowed to carry guns. Many people believe that these measures could potentially reduce criminal activity. However, some argue that the root causes of mass shootings, such as unequal financial distribution and economic inequality, could never be fully addressed through such regulations. On the flip side, there were concerns that concealed carry laws could lead to an increase in gun violence, particularly if individuals carrying weapons were not adequately trained or if firearms are accessible to those who shouldn't have them. Owning gold. This rule might sound bizarre and even unfair, but there's a good reason for it. The origins of the rule trace back to 1933, during the Great Depression when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. This order made it illegal for U.S. citizens to own gold bullion or gold coins, compelling individuals to sell their gold to the federal government in exchange for U.S. dollars at a fixed price. The rationale behind this strategic move was to combat deflation and stabilize the economy. By seizing citizens' gold, the government aimed to increase the money supply while encouraging spending, which was crucial during the economic downturn. The prohibition on gold ownership lasted until 1974 when President Gerald Ford signed legislation which officially lifted the ban and allowed citizens to own gold once more. However, the plan did backfire, as this rule implicitly created a pathway to the black market and led to a significant loss of wealth for individuals who were forced to sell their gold to the government at a set price. Crossing state lines with a duck. Odd though it may sound, crossing state lines with a duck is illegal. Ducks and other birds can carry diseases like the avian flu, so transporting them across state lines without proper documents and permits could pose a threat to the local ecosystem. These regulations help to manage wildlife populations in certain areas, and if you're thinking about grabbing a cute duck you saw on the road or highway, don't do it. The U.S. federal government, particularly under the Lacey Act, provides the framework for wildlife protection. However, many states have added their own specific regulations to prevent unlicensed or unregulated transportation of animals, including ducks, across the state border. If you own a pet duck, you may be surprised to learn that you need travel documentation to take your duck across state lines. Reading comic books in school. Remember that comic book code era in schools during the 1960s? Comic books faced significant slander during that time, which often disappointed students and dedicated readers. Comic books were viewed as potentially harmful to children's education and moral development, leading schools across the U.S. and other countries to adopt rules against reading them in classrooms or bringing them to school. During this period, psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wertham fueled the controversy with his book Seduction of the Innocent. He claimed that comic books, especially crime and horror comics, contributed to juvenile delinquency, violence, and sexual deviance. And in response, the Comics Code Authority implemented strict regulations. Marrying someone of a different race. This offensive rule was indeed legally implemented as a regulation during the 1960s, created to emphasize racial segregation while maintaining white supremacy. It was designed to uphold the so-called racial purity of certain groups, particularly white people, by preventing interracial relationships. By the 1960s, these laws were still in effect in several U.S. states, but they were increasingly being challenged in courts and public opinion. The primary goal was to prevent interracial relationships between black people and white people, but these laws often extended to other racial groups like Native Americans, Asians, and Latinos. This awful law lasted in the United States for over 200 years. However, the final and most prominent legal blow came in 1967 when the U.S. Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia ruled that banning interracial marriage was unconstitutional. While most couples from the South were the main targets and often faced violent repercussions, the abolition of this particular law initially received mixed reactions. Driving without shoes. Driving without shoes is considered illegal in some places, which initially shocked a lot of people. However, safety concerns were prioritized, and the idea that driving without shoes could be dangerous arose from worries about driver control and pedal operation. It was believed that certain footwear, or the lack of it, could affect a driver's ability to operate the vehicle safely. Although it wasn't exactly a codified law, a lot of people upheld the rule regardless, and we can all admit that driving barefoot can be more comfortable than wearing shoes, especially during hot weather. Some people believe that driving barefoot allows for better tactile feedback and control when pressing the pedals. While it's entirely opinion-based, it's certainly a peculiar rule. Gambling on horse racing without a license. The rules and regulations surrounding horse racing and gambling were established by state legislatures, which included laws that made it illegal to gamble on horse racing without a license. The primary goal of these legislatures was to regulate legitimate gambling activities while preventing illegal betting and associated crimes. The illegal gambling industry is often linked to organized crime. During the 1960s, many illegal bookmakers operated with connections to criminal organizations, which led to violence and corruption in some areas. Practicing witchcraft. Back in the day, practicing witchcraft was actually illegal, and it was a serious offense. If you're wondering how this bizarre rule originated, it traces back to colonial times, particularly during the Salem witch trials of the late 17th century. Many anti-witchcraft laws are remnants of earlier centuries, often reflecting societal fears regarding the supernatural. In the 1960s, practicing witchcraft was not strictly illegal, but some states had laws against fortune-telling, occult practices, and the use of magical spells, which were sometimes tied to more broad anti-vice legislation. Historically, witch hunts led to thousands of executions and the persecution of individuals, predominantly women, who were accused of witchcraft. The societal fear that surrounded witchcraft has often resulted in tragic consequences. Many equated witchcraft with Satanism, which only heightened paranoia about witches. Women serving alcohol. Up until the late 1970s, women were not only not to serve alcohol, but were also not permitted to enter a pub, a club, or a bar. This wasn't only a popular rule in the United States, but in most other countries as well. People believed that bars and saloons were inappropriate places for women to be, as it could ruin their reputation. Society at that time was heavily focused on maintaining modesty and purity of women, particularly in a public role. Policymakers and the public alike feared that women working in these environments would be more vulnerable to sexual harassment and assault. Even after the rules became more relaxed, not a whole lot of women were employed in such an establishment. Additionally, they weren't served full pints. Even if they requested one, they could end up with 2 half-pint glasses instead. However, by the late 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement strongly opposed these laws, viewing them as part of a larger system of gender inequality. Women, particularly those who wanted to work in the hospitality industry, campaigned to have the rules overturned. Public swearing. Public restrictions were quite common back then, and people believed in preserving their culture, which led to restrictions on public swearing. Laws against public swearing and obscenity had existed for many years before the 1960s. The 60s were a period of cultural transformation, but conservative views still influenced laws surrounding language, decency, and behavior. Swearing in public was considered offensive, especially in mixed companies or around women and children, and lawmakers were often enforcing rules that aligned with societal norms of respectability. This rule applied to everyone, from children to adults, and if children swore, they faced serious consequences. However, over time, public swearing was criticized by many as a restriction on freedom of speech. Moreover, these laws were often enforced in discriminatory ways, with minority groups and lower-income individuals more likely to be punished for swearing in public compared to wealthier and privileged people. Transporting firewood across state lines. It all began when recognizing the dangers of invasive species and pathogens transported with firewood. Pests like the gypsy moth, the emerald ash borer, and Dutch elm were known to spread diseases via infested firewood, which could devastate the local tree populations. And so the rule was made in response to outbreaks of pests and diseases that threaten both agriculture and the natural ecosystem. The prime reason for this was the transportation of firewood across state lines. The USDA, along with state agricultural and environmental agencies, likely played a significant role in establishing these rules, and the goal was to protect forests and crops from pests, particularly those who could hitch a ride on firewood. Using a fake name at a hotel. If you're wondering whether you could book a hotel under a fake name or alias, the answer is no. Not only during the 60s, but even today, using a name that doesn't match your ID or passport could potentially get you in trouble. In the 1960s, there was growing concern about crime, and hotels wanted to know the identities of their guests to protect both themselves and others who were staying there. Staff ensured that guests used their real names to confirm they weren't involved in any illegal activities. However, not everyone was pleased with this rule, and some saw it as an invasion of privacy or something that would draw unnecessary attention. For guests who wish to maintain their privacy, hotels offered a feature called silent rooms. They would add silent next to the guest name, so if anyone inquired, the staff could immediately know not to share any information except with the guests themselves or authorized staff. Swearing in front of women. It's not only about how we dress or present ourselves, it's also about what comes out of our mouth. Trash talking and crass words were generally frowned upon, and swearing in front of a woman would take it a step further and was considered illegal. The concept of free speech was not fully embraced back in the day. The rule against swearing in front of women originated from Victorian-era morality. These laws aimed to promote public decency and were influenced by societal views that deemed women to be more delicate and in need of protection from vulgarity. During the 1960s, people were heavily influenced by traditional gender roles, which portrayed women as pure and symbols of refinement, and men were expected to be gracious and gallant to uphold women's reputations. Even films from that time featured little to no swearing, and the D word could probably have gotten you in jail. Running for office while drunk. Partying on a Sunday and still struggling with a hangover on Monday morning, yet you decide to power through and go to work. In the 1960s, running for office while drunk was considered illegal. As unusual as it sounds, neither the public nor the government could tolerate intoxicated individuals in public. Many regions had strict public intoxication laws and moral expectations for politicians, and people were expected to maintain a certain level of decorum, and this rule applied to everyone from the private sector to politicians. It ensured that politicians upheld a respectable public image, which helped to preserve trust in government institutions. This was a look at 20 weird things from the 1960s that were illegal. Which one of them shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another memory in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.